Attacks on the United States. A nation grapples with the horror that life may never be the same again.
And while officials conduct a global manhunt for those involved in the devastating terror.
He was an exemplary human being. He was a hero long before this happened, and he was a hero to our entire family.
And relatives share the pain of the loved ones they have lost.
Hello, I'm Relitza Vasilova.
And I'm Jonathan Mann at the CNN Center. This is CNN's continuing coverage of America under attack.
More details are emerging as the massive investigation of the attacks in New York and Washington proceeds. Law enforcement sources are saying as many as 50 people may have been involved in the planning and execution of the attacks. The FBI is assuming between 12 and 14 hijackers were involved. On a tip from the FBI, German police searched an apartment in Hamburg where two men believed to be linked to the attacks used to live. Police also detained several people for questioning. Earlier, the FBI swarmed into a Boston hotel, taking several people there into custody for questioning. And in Florida, investigators are looking through documents, home computers, and flight school records. Officials believe some of the hijackers received flight training in Florida.
As rescue workers search for survivors and victims, New York authorities were briefly distracted by a bomb scare at the Empire State Building a few hours ago. Authorities, or rather thousands of people, were evacuated from the building and surrounding streets, but it turned out to be a false alarm. Meanwhile, the grim work continued at the site of New York's once proud Twin Towers. Only 5 survivors were rescued Wednesday. One New York City firefighter says emergency workers have to be prepared for the worst.
It's a lot of devastation, but we have to deal with it. It's something that we have to do. I mean, nobody really prepares for anything on this kind of scale. And, every news you hear is just more and more bad news.
New York Governor George Pataki and U.S. Senators Charles Schumer and Hillary Rodham Clinton joined New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani as he pledged to rebuild the World Trade Center.
We have to all work together now and work together to make sure that we save as many lives as possible, rescue the people that we can rescue, and rebuild the city of New York and the World Trade Center to be even greater and more wonderful and more beautiful than it was before.
We're going to show the rest of the nation, we're going to show the rest of the world that the New Yorkers are not intimidated by terrorism, that we don't surrender to this type of cowardly act, but we will come back stronger than ever.
For his part, U.S. President George W. Bush visited the scene of the attack on the Pentagon. He said he was overwhelmed by the devastation.
Coming here makes me sad on the one hand. It also makes me angry. And our country will, however, not be cowed by terrorists, by people who don't share the same values we share, by people who are willing to destroy people's lives.
The United States says it wants to form a coalition to not only find those responsible for these attacks, but to root out and eliminate terrorism as a whole.
We're building a strong coalition to go after these perpetrators, but more broadly, to go after terrorism wherever we find it in the world. It's a scourge not only against the United States, but against civilization, and it must be brought to an end.
U.S. officials acknowledge the rules of engagement have changed.
We are, in a sense, seeing the definition of a new battlefield in the world, a 21st century battlefield. And it is a different kind of conflict. It is something that is not unique to this century, to be sure, but it is, given our geography and given our circumstance, it is in a major sense new for this country.
President Bush and his top aides spent much of Wednesday lining up international support for a U.S. response to the attacks. Much of that support was forthcoming. At an emergency meeting in Brussels, NATO made a decision that could pave the way for a collective response to the carnage.
On September the 12th, the North Atlantic Council met again. In response to the appalling attacks perpetrated yesterday against the United States of America. The Council agreed that if it is determined that this attack was directed from abroad against the United States, it shall be regarded as an action covered by Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, which states that an armed attack against one or more of the Allies in Europe or in North America shall be considered an attack against them all.
NATO's decision opens the way for the first use in the 52-year history of the alliance of a provision stating, as we've just heard, an attack on one NATO state is an attack against everyone. U.S. stock markets will remain closed Thursday. New York Stock Exchange Chairman Richard Grasso says the exchange will open no later than Monday, though. The stock market shutdown is the longest since the outbreak of World War I. It kept markets closed from July to November of 1914. Meanwhile, the Federal Aviation Administration allowed a limited number of commercial flights Wednesday, this after the grounding of the entire U.S. commercial fleet Tuesday. The U.S. Transportation Secretary said most flights diverted on Tuesday could finish their routes as soon as airports meet tough new security measures.
In New York, a scene of unimaginable devastation. A city famous for its vitality and confidence is dazed and somber. From above the wafting smoke of lower Manhattan, we're joined now by Garrick Utley. Garrick.
Yes, good morning again. Really, it's here in New York. A question about a rather strange scene, perhaps, on Tuesday morning down here in lower Manhattan, just after that plane flew into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. The unusual sight for most people was this. As streams of workers in the tower were trying to race out into the streets to save themselves from the flames, others were racing in. Who were they? Well, the answer is clearly they're members of the New York City Fire Department, men and women racing in, climbing the stairs, not only to fight the fire, which was so far up in the building they probably couldn't reach it quickly, but to evacuate as many people as possible. Why do they do that, these firemen and firewomen? And we know the bottom line on this, the human cost of it. Approximately 300 members of the New York City Fire Department have been lost. We want to take a moment right now to hear from two of them, a fireman and a firewoman.
For about the past 10 years, Amy and I have been working together as a documentary film crew, and we specialize in the emergency services. They'll have to pump, millions of gallons of water onto this fire in order to put it out. It's the worst type of fire to put out because it's so deeply seated. The overwhelming smell of the fire is that of burning electrical wires.
You inhale it, and I don't even know how to describe the stench. It's filth and it's degradation. I don't know what the overall damage would be on a person's lungs if they were out there working in it every day.
We're still in the midst of trying to put the fires out and get people.
It appears to have been a pancake collapse, which is floor upon floor upon floor falling on top of each other all the way down. The fire was burning so hot when it hit the upper floors that it actually melted and the structure just came down on top of itself.
Building number 5 is probably going to come down completely within the next couple of days, I would imagine. As it settles and as it comes tumbling down, it begins to make noises as if the building is crying. The various moans that the building makes as the steel buckles and the bricks begin to collapse.
Seeing the firefighters all sitting in a row lined up along the curb coming out from Building 5 when we left. They were filthy, they were exhausted, they were emotionally wrought. There is a lot of danger. None of our firefighting training encompasses acts of war, so we need to be very careful.
Firefighters, law enforcement, paramedics, we are the first responders on any terrorism incident here in the United States. It's not the military. And we need to begin thinking like the military thinks. And to have 300 of our brothers and sisters perish in a single incident is something that we can't even fathom. It'll be years before these firefighters will be able to go back to work and with the same attitude that they had before.
By the way, the building number 5 the firefighters were referring to is a 5 World Trade Plaza. That's a 9-story building, which was also damaged and was burning. And as you heard, they're afraid that it may come tumbling down, too. Let's get some more insights as to the rescue operation currently underway, what is actually happening there, what it is like to be involved in that operation from a volunteer. Kevin McGarry, who has been on the scene working, is with us by telephone. Kevin, good evening, or good morning, I should say. Tell us a bit about what you've been doing down there in Lower Manhattan.
Well, I spent about 15 hours in Lower Manhattan from early this morning until about 10 p.m. this evening in the rescue efforts and recovering bodies, primarily bodies. I didn't see anyone alive in the 15 hours I was there, although I was able to assist in the rescue of approximately 6 bodies and a lot of body parts.
It must be pretty grim, very difficult under these circumstances. I think all of us can understand that and really appreciate what you and your colleagues are doing. Tell us a bit about what your colleagues, your fellow workers are saying. I mean, how much optimism, how much hope do they hold out when you're confronted with that rubble, that mountain of rubble?
The mountain of rubble is unfortunately being sifted through by the handful. Down deep inside of 3-4 stories down below into the garage area, we're removing the debris by hand into 5-gallon buckets, handing them up and being dumped and sifted through a second time, looking for any sign of body parts or jewelry, watches, any type of wallets, identification, anything at all.
You said, Kevin, that you took part in the recovery of 6 people who were lost there. Any indication as to other dead that have been recovered, as to how many have been found in the last several hours?
At the last body that I had carried to the morgue area, which was a semi-trailer, was approximately 20-some-odd bodies in there at that time, and that was at 10 p.m.
And what is the mood among the workers there as to prospects of finding more?
Very high. Everyone has the hopes of finding yet another survivor. They're digging deep and they're digging hard, looking, but again, it's being done by hand. The iron workers that are working in there are working to remove the steel, of which is on top of a lot of the bodies. Sifting through the debris, a lot of the body parts and the debris are one and the same. It's just becoming, right now at this point, foul. The smell is starting to come from the dead. So the bodies are a little bit easier to identify at this point, although it's going to be a long, long process, months.
Kevin, are you going to go back in there again?
I'll be back in there tomorrow. I will be back in there as long as they need help. I'll be back in there.
Kevin McGarry on the scene. Thank you very much for sharing what you've been through and your colleagues down there and the rescue teams have been through. Let's go down to Lower Manhattan, near that site that Kevin was talking about, to CNN's Alessandro Vinci. Alessandro, what are you seeing from your perspective right now?
Well, Gary, seems incredible, but yet there are many incredible things about this story. More than 40 hours after those 2 hijacked planes hit the World Trade Center, the 2 towers, and then they collapsed. There are still smoke coming out of the debris of those 2 collapsing towers, a high billowing big cloud of white smoke billowing on top of those rubbles, and an indication how difficult. We heard one of the volunteers there telling us how difficult the operation is going on down there, the fact that still the debris, the iron and the metals are still smoldering, certainly making that effort even more difficult. We spent some time earlier on the ground there where hundreds of rescue workers, some of the paramedics and the police officers are all involved in that rescue operation. We saw a couple of refrigerator trucks there, probably trying to take some of the body parts, some of the bodies that have been recovered back to the morgue, and of course also a long line of dumpster trucks bringing out some of the rubble that has been put on those dumpster trucks to make some room for more trucks to come in. We understand so far more than 3,000 tons of rubble has been removed from the site. Earlier on, the New York Mayor, Rudolph Giuliani, said that 82 bodies had already been recovered. That number perhaps a bit higher now, since the recovery operation is still ongoing. There are 16 identified bodies, Of those 82, 16 have been identified, as we heard, many body parts. That number of casualties will be rising probably as the rescue operation will continue. Mayor Giuliani requested to the Federal Emergency Management Agency 6,000 body bags. Meanwhile, the entire area south of 14th Street in Lower Manhattan remains sealed off. Several blocks of Lower Manhattan remain also without electricity. That is why many of the people living, especially the elderly people living in the buildings here, have been evacuated. Some of the people decided to leave on their own. We also met several local Lower Manhattans, if you want. People who live here all their life. They said, we're not going to leave on a day like this. Back to you, Garrick.
Thank you very much. Alessio Vinci there on the scene. We'll be coming back to you through the early morning hours here in the East Coast for your update reports. One little footnote as to an incident which occurred just a few minutes ago before we went to Alessio. There was a strange and unfamiliar sound in the skies over Manhattan. Obviously, for a couple of days now, there have been no signs of airplanes because the airports have been closed down, and Manhattan is an approachway to LaGuardia Airport. But about 3 a.m., or 3:05 a.m., we suddenly heard the sound of a fighter plane, and then a second fighter plane roaring over the heart of Manhattan here in New York City. What were two fighter planes doing, roaring with their afterburners on it, appeared to our ears, waking people out of their sleep? No idea, but that's what they were doing. Strange things happen in Manhattan in the middle of the night. Back to you now in Atlanta.
Garrick, thank you.
Investigators have spread up and down the East Coast in an exhaustive effort to identify those responsible for Tuesday's attacks. Mike Betcher reports now on the leads and what they reveal about the attacks.
From Maine to Florida, the investigation moved quickly along the eastern seaboard.
We have, in the last 24 hours, taken the manifests and used those as an evidentiary base, and have talked to many of the families of the victims, and have successfully, I believe, identified many of the hijackers on each of the 4 flights that went down.
Federal investigators now believe they know the identity of 4 men capable of piloting the 2 planes that left Boston and crashed into the World Trade Center. The key, rental cars parked by the suspected terrorist at Portland International Airport and Boston's Logan Airport, each yielding clues that ultimately led investigators to flight schools in Florida.
A number of the suspected hijackers were trained as pilots in the United States.
Rental records for the car left in Portland brought investigators to residences in Vero Beach, Florida, which were searched by the FBI. Inside one house, pictures of Adnan Bukhari and a pilot certificate from a Florida flight school in his name. Also found inside the residence, another pilot certificate for Amir Abbas Bukhari. Another certificate indicates that at least one of the Bukharis participated in a program to help train Saudi Airlines employees. Federal investigators believe the 2 men are brothers and prime suspects. FBI agents also visited other Florida locations after gathering clues from the second rental car parked at Boston's Logan Airport that led to the identity of 2 more men, also pilots, Mohammed Atta and Marwan Youssef Al-Shehi, who received at least some flight training at Huffman Aviation in Venice, Florida. Charles Voss is a bookkeeper at Huffman Aviation who briefly allowed the 2 men to stay at his house.
They were, like I said, students, and they arrived over there a year ago. It was in last July. And when they first arrived, they had no place to stay. They just popped in pretty much, as I recall, unannounced. And so we provided them, for the benefit of the flight school, provided them a place to stay for a few days.
At least one person believed to be an acquaintance of the Bukharis has been taken into custody for questioning.
There have been occasions where we have interviewed individuals and come to find that the individual is out of status, and that individual has been detained on an immigration hold. But there have been no arrests relating to these hijackings at this point.
Having found the 4 men, federal investigators believe piloted the 2 hijacked jets into the World Trade Center towers. They are now scouring Florida flight schools, searching for the pilots of the other 2 jetliners, one that crashed in Pennsylvania, the other that rammed the Pentagon. Mike Betcher, CNN, Atlanta.
We have a dramatic glimpse into some of the terror during the hijacking of one flight. CNN has obtained a partial copy of cockpit transcripts as heard by air traffic controllers. Here's Justice Department correspondent Kelly Arena.
Sometime before United Airlines Flight 93 went down in Pennsylvania, a microphone in the cockpit was left open. Air traffic controllers heard shouting, someone yelling, "Get out of here!" The microphone is momentarily turned off. It comes back on. Scuffling is heard, and again, a voice yells, "Get out of here!" The microphone is again turned off. When it's turned on again, it is clear the pilot is no longer in the cockpit. Someone is heard speaking in broken English, in what was described as an Arabic accent, telling passengers, quote, "There is a bomb on board. This is the captain speaking. Remain in your seat. There is a bomb on board. Stay quiet. We are meeting their demands. We are returning to the airport." While this was going on in the cockpit, we have information about what was happening in the cabin. One passenger, 31-year-old Jeremy Glick, was flying with his 2-month-old child. He called home from the doomed plane. He said the passengers were herded to the rear of the plane by a trio of hijackers, armed with knives and a red box they say contained a bomb. When Glick's family confirmed for him what another passenger heard, that a plane had already struck the World Trade Center, Glick dropped the phone, then returned to tell his family the male passengers had taken a vote to attack the hijackers. Glick wasn't heard from again. The plane held 38 passengers and a crew of 8. Kelly Arena, CNN, Washington.
Among the businesses in the World Trade Center's Twin Towers, there were 31 countries represented them. And one of them, Britain, is expecting the number of its casualties to keep rising. The word we have now from British Foreign Secretary Jack Straw is that the number of dead is approaching 100. Earlier, a spokesman for British Prime Minister Tony Blair said it could go into the hundreds. The Prime Minister has recalled Parliament from its summer recess.
President Bush has vowed to punish those responsible and says America will be victorious in what he calls a battle of good versus evil, and he's getting backing at home and abroad. Both houses of Congress have approved unanimously a resolution vowing retaliation against those found responsible. Our senior White House correspondent John King reports.
The president got his first look at the devastation as planning for a possible military response intensified. The White House is asking Congress to pass a resolution authorizing the use of force to retaliate for the deadly terrorist attacks and making a major diplomatic push seeking international support as well. Mr. Bush called the leaders of Britain, Canada, France, Germany, Russia, and China and welcomed a NATO statement calling the attacks on the United States tantamount to a strike against the alliance.
We will rally the world. We will be patient. We'll be focused. And we will be steadfast in our determination. This battle will take time and resolve. But make no mistake about it, we will win.
Mr. Bush met twice with his national security team, and sources tell CNN the discussions included talk of potential military responses and an update on the fast-developing investigation. In the words of one senior official familiar with the evidence, quote, "Everything points to the terrorist network of Osama bin Laden."
This enemy hides in shadows and has no regard for human life. This is an enemy who preys on innocent and unsuspecting people, then runs for cover. But it won't be able to run for cover forever.
The Bush team also responded to questions about why it took the president so long to return to Washington after the attacks. The administration said it had credible and reliable information that the jet that barreled into the Pentagon was initially heading toward the White House. And it said there was reason to believe Air Force One also was a target. And that is why Mr. Bush stopped at 2 military bases on a 9-hour trip back to Washington from Florida and had fighter jet escorts on the final leg home.
The information that we had was real and credible about Air Force One. The manner in which Air Force One operated maintained the security of Air Force One at all times.
The president met with congressional leaders seeking quick agreement on an emergency spending bill.
And officials report progress in both sets of talks, one aimed at authorizing $20 billion for the recovery and early investigative efforts, the other backing the use of force to retaliate for terrorist strikes Mr. Bush equates to acts of war. John King, CNN, the White House.
Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld apparently is trying to get U.S. forces ready for combat. In a taped message to America's soldiers, the defense chief said that much more will be expected of them in weeks and months to come. Mark Potter joins us now from the Pentagon with the latest there. Mark?
Well, good morning, Jonathan. There are a lot of activities on the part of the U.S. military right now, and some of them are being witnessed by the citizens of this country. There are a number of aspects that we can actually see with our own eyes. U.S. officials have dispatched a number of aircraft carriers and ships along the and warships along the east and west coast of this country, where they are in what is being described as a defensive posture. Now, on the East Coast, from the U.S. Atlantic Fleet in Norfolk, there are 2 carriers and 5 warships in place. According to the Navy, they are there to contribute to the air defense of Washington, D.C. and New York City. The carriers are the John F. Kennedy and the George Washington. Also activated, we just received this news, the USNS Comfort, a hospital ship based in Baltimore. It is sailing for New York and is expected to arrive there Friday. On the West Coast, another carrier, the USS John C. Stennis, deployed from San Diego. It and 14 other ships are patrolling along the West Coast and along Hawaii. Now, something that people may not be aware of right now, the U.S. military is in control of all airspace over the United States. Civilian planes are grounded, domestic and international planes grounded right now. The only planes in the sky belong to the U.S. military. And so citizens in a number of cities, including here in Washington and certainly in New York, have been seeing fighter jets flying overhead on combat air patrol. We are told that control is expected to return to the civilian agency, the Federal Aviation Administration, sometime later today. Now, here in Washington and New York, again, citizens have also watched the deployment of the National Guard. In this city, the capital city, we can see trucks along the roads. We can see Humvees parked at intersections, National Guard personnel standing watch on street corners. That's not something that the people here are used to seeing. This is unusual. And in New York City also, the National Guard is involved in the search and the rescue effort. Now, across the globe in the Persian Gulf area, there are 2 carrier battle groups in place right now. The USS Carl Vinson arrived on scene to replace the USS Enterprise group. But before the Enterprise and its group could get very far along, they only made it to the Arabian Sea. They were ordered to stop and to stay in position. So now both groups are in the general area. With those 2 groups there are some 30 warships in place supporting those 2 carriers, also about 150 aircraft. So a lot of activity on the part of the U.S. military, some far away, some close enough for citizens of this country to see. Back to you.
Mark Potter at the Pentagon. Thanks very much. Ralitza.
Pressure is mounting on the Taliban government of Afghanistan, which the United States has accused of sheltering Osama bin Laden. Nick Robertson joins us now via video phone from Kabul with the latest on the Afghan angle on the story. Nick.
For relief for this morning, 3 United Nations planes took off from Kabul airport bound for Pakistan. On board were 3 international diplomats, one from the United States, one from Australia, and one from Germany. They've been here helping, trying to secure the release of 8 international aid workers here on charges of trying to convert Muslims here to Christianity. They have left. Along with them, the last of all the international United Nations staff here. There were 80 in country in total. They are also gone. Along with them as well, many foreign overseas journalists who were working here. They also have gone. The International Committee for the Red Cross has begun pulling out its 30 international staff who are in this country. A reduction of all international and overseas staff by independent, non-governmental aid groups is also underway and expected to be completed later today. On the streets of Kabul, there is a growing apprehension and fear about what could be coming next. People here have been listening to the radio, the Taliban radio here, and on that radio station there have been reports about what's been going on in the United States. People on the streets here also, like their government, condemning the terrorism, offering their sympathies. but very concerned about the possibility that they could be involved in retribution attacks on Afghanistan. Taliban leadership late last night issuing further statements. Spokesman Abdul Hai Mutmain from the spiritual leadership base in Kandahar in southern Afghanistan, appealing to the United States, saying that Afghans were poor, saying that any attacks on the country would not help Afghans and Afghanistan, saying that the cost of any single missile was greater than the cost of any single building in Afghanistan. Also saying that killing the Taliban leadership was not a worthwhile thing. And again, distancing Osama bin Laden from the center of international suspicion for these attacks, saying that Osama bin Laden himself could not have been responsible. So clearly apprehension within the leadership of the Taliban. Very significantly here in Kabul as well, the population and the Taliban leadership concerned that any attacks on Kabul could help open the doorway to the Northern Alliance. That is the group that the Taliban have been fighting against to gain control of the country. The Northern Alliance controls about 5% of the territory in the northeast part of Afghanistan. There is a front line 30 miles north of the city Kabul. It's been static for the last 5 years, more or less. There was heavy fighting. We could hear heavy fighting on that front line last night. Taliban jet fighters were taking off, heading in that direction. The fear amongst some of the population here and amongst the Taliban leadership is that should there be a sustained attack on the Kabul area, that could help push forward an advance by their opposition to retake Kabul. These are all concerns right now in the forefront of the minds, not only of the people here, but also the leadership. Lolita.
Nick, thank you.
Pakistan is the main supporter of the Taliban, and while Osama bin Laden has not officially been termed a suspect in the attacks, Washington is expecting help from Pakistan in the investigation.
We have not made a determination yet as to who is responsible for yesterday's attack, but we thought as we gather information and as we look at possible sources of the attack, it would be useful to point out to the Pakistani leadership at every level that we are looking for and expecting their fullest cooperation and their help and support as we conduct this investigation and as we generate more information.
In a statement issued Thursday, Pakistan pledged full cooperation with the United States.
While the world's attention was focused on the U.S., Israeli tanks and bulldozers rolled into the West Bank for a second straight day. The Israeli military says it attacked several Palestinian outposts in the West Bank in an effort to disrupt terror activity in the area. Witnesses say residents of Jenin exchanged fire with Israeli troops who destroyed a police compound they first attacked Tuesday. Palestinian officials say the attacks were unprovoked and accuse Israel of using the U.S. tragedy to divert attention from their attacks on Palestinians.
Saudi Arabia joined several other Arab states in expressing sympathy for the U.S. This as investigators disclosed that at least 2 of the men suspected in the attacks were Saudi nationals.
If this case is proven beyond doubt that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the Arab people, the Muslim people will help to expose the identities of the perpetrators of this crime. Lately, the media mentioned Osama bin Laden as a Saudi citizen. We in the kingdom, the government and the people of Saudi Arabia refuse to have any person affiliated with terrorism to be connected to our country.
U.S. Attorney General John Ashcroft calls the probe into Tuesday's attacks the most massive and intensive investigation in American history. And as David Ensor reports, U.S. officials apparently have already made some significant progress.
U.S. officials say on the passenger manifests of the hijacked planes used in the attacks, they found names associated with terrorist groups. Intelligence officials say the evidence still points to the al-Qaeda group, headed by Osama bin Laden.
There had to be some brains behind this. We have some good, promising leads. They're obviously being followed.
Publicly, the Bush administration is accusing no one so far, while warning nations they too will pay for any help given to those who attacked New York and Washington.
We will hold accountable those countries that provide support, that give host nation, if you can call it that, support and facilities to these kinds of terrorist groups.
Afghanistan's Taliban government has long offered haven to bin Laden, but U.S. officials say they have no evidence thus far of any state directly assisting the attacks in New York and Washington. Many analysts argue that such a coordinated broadside could not have been possible without it.
Osama bin Laden represents a complete terrorist network. He will have one or more state sponsors, countries that he's either based in or working in collusion with. There'll have been passport support, communication support.
One thing I think that ought to make us a bit suspicious about whether bin Laden was involved in it alone or not is that he goes to great lengths to advertise himself. And when you see something like that, you begin to wonder whether or not there may be an effort to draw our attention solely to him, to the neglect of someone who may be his principal contractor.
If there was state support, a number of terrorism experts point to Iraq as the most likely suspect. A statement from President Saddam Hussein on Iraqi television said, quote, "The United States reaps the thorns that its rulers have sown in the world."
U.S. officials say they are developing good law enforcement and intelligence leads. They do not know yet who was behind these attacks, nor whether any state assisted them. But they believe they soon will. David Ensor, CNN, Washington.
Experts say the magnitude of Tuesday's attack suggests that the action was organized by a highly sophisticated group or groups of terrorists intent on generating chaos and fear, as much damage and loss of life as possible. And it represents a massive breach of U.S. national security. Joining us from our London studios, Paul Slaughter, Chief Executive Officer of the international security firm Task International. Mr. Slaughter, thank you very much for joining us. What do you think?
Pleasure.
What do you think of the security measures that we're hearing now that the FAA is planning to introduce at U.S. airports?
I think it's probably long awaited. The big problem with security matters is that anyone who wants to perpetrate these type of crimes, they've always got the advantage of time. And they know when they're going to do it, where they're going to do it. All security matters are breachable. You can either go round, over, through, under. You cannot have a complete 100% guaranteed security measures in place. The big problem is that the perpetrators of crimes such as this, as I said, know when they're going to do it. And no security matters can fully protect establishments, airlines, buildings, or anything like that.
So what can protect them better?
Obviously, increased security matters, and you just have to try and make places like that a harder target to attack. With the advent of X-ray machines, perhaps body searching, greater vetting of passengers, but of course this imposes on travel, civil liberties, things like that. It has to be a balancing act. But unfortunately, as has quite often been said, and the IRA have been quoted, they only have to be lucky once. And unfortunately, when they are as lucky as this, you're going to have the body toll that we've seen and will see in future days to come.
Mr. Slaughter, what about the cockpit, making it very difficult to breach the cockpit door and get inside and hijack a plane?
That's one measure, but of course you have to take into account the human factor. And obviously when the terrorists got on board and probably started attacking the stewardesses or passengers with the knives they had on board, it takes a very determined, logical flight crew not to open the door when they're hearing screaming, pandemonium, panicking within the cabin itself. And for the pilot or co-pilot or engineer not to open the door to try and find out what's happening is a very, very difficult thing to do. I don't believe you can criticize them for trying to find out what's happening behind them. Perhaps we need to have cameras installed on aircraft so the pilot can see what's going on behind him. But of course all these measures take financing, and probably you're going to have maybe acts of government to ensure that these take place.
What do you think was the biggest mistake that was made by U.S. officials in this case?
I think that's very difficult to say. It's the big problem is that you have to balance security measures with civil liberties and also with people travelling all over the world. If you have a complete security package, excuse me, you're not going to have people travelling because they won't want to. Obviously, allowing these people onto the aircraft with whatever weapons they had, and all we've heard is that they had knives. Well, you can do as much damage with a 3-inch blade as you can with a 6-9-inch blade. And it's quite easy to get those on board aircraft. I mean, knives now can be secreted in belt buckles, in pens that work, and all they have to do is to grab hold of a stewardess or a passenger, stab them in the right place, and you're going to have copious quantities of blood all over the place, which instills panic in people.
Mrs. Slaughter, thank you very much.
Okay.
Thousands are feared dead. The United States and its NATO allies are preparing to respond, and families have been torn apart, perhaps irreparably. But beyond the devastating human toll, there could be another impact from all of this, specifically on the global economy and the markets. Richard Quest joins us now from London, where he's been watching business unfold. Richard?
Many thanks, Jonathan. Officials at the European Central Bank will meet in Frankfurt later this Thursday. They'll be deciding what more they can do to limit the global economic impact of the attack on the World Trade Center. There have been calls for European countries to cut interest rates to help stabilise the global economy, to bring an air of stability in this uncertain time. But many analysts do not expect the ECB to cut its short-term interest rates when they do have that meeting. Let's take a look at the latest currency rates that we're seeing around the globe. You'll see now that the US dollar has gained back some strength at 119 Japanese yen. Against the euro, it's just at 90 US cents to the new single currency. The new European trading day is underway. Let's catch up with how trading is going and what stocks may be of interest. Liz George is at the London Stock Exchange. Liz?
Richard, thanks very much indeed. Notwithstanding the feelings here very much of shock and distress at what has happened in New York, there is a feeling of wanting to conduct business as usual and really getting on with trading. Although, of course, volumes are very, very light and trading is extremely muted. Now, we saw a very volatile day on the markets yesterday. I was talking to Jeremy Stretch of the Bank of Canada earlier on, and he was saying people really didn't have any idea where to price things, and that's why we were seeing such huge leaps around in the markets and such enormous volatility. And really today is likely to be very much more of the same. The markets are open, and this is where they've opened at, all of them trading slightly lower today. Towards the end of the day yesterday, we began to recover some of those dramatic losses, but now they're beginning to fall off again. Everyone really now looking towards the US, hoping that the US will open and also give some direction, but of course being very aware that once the US does open for trade on the equity markets, there may be some dramatic reaction there, a big sell-off going on there until things come out, and people saying really it's going to be about 4 weeks before we begin to see any calms return. Let me just show you one or two individual stocks. Of course, it was the consumer cyclicals which saw a very big sell-off. Companies like British Airways. British Airways losing around about $9 million a day from its planes being grounded. It's down 7.21%. The insurers, of course, which have risk over in the US, saw a very big sell-off yesterday. Today, they're beginning to come back a little bit. Allianz, Europe's largest insurer, up 1.65% in the early market. And LVMH, the consumer luxury goods company, also selling off today, worrying about what impact this is going to have on the US consumer. Richard.
Liz George at the London Stock Exchange. Gold and oil have been much in the news. Let's catch up with how those have traded, starting with gold, where the price is now at around $278 an ounce. It's reversed some of the gains that were seen in the initial panic after the attack. Now markets starting to calm down somewhat. And Brent crude at around $28 an ounce. Again, prices starting to come back as people realise that supply will be maintained. Over now to Maggie Lake in New York to bring us up to date with events on financial markets and what we can look forward to there. Maggie?
Richard, of course, the stock markets will not be trading today. That gives us all time to contemplate the events. And, of course, the task of picking up the pieces now lies ahead. Companies are grappling with how they will cope in the wake of the attack. Among the hardest hit will be the airline industry. For the first time in history, all commercial air travel in the United States was suspended Tuesday. Airports were again closed Wednesday, and service will be limited at best later today, which is, of course, Thursday morning. The effect of the disruption is staggering. The airline industry generates about $90 to $100 billion in revenues. About 4,000 planes fly a day domestically. While flights are grounded, the losses work out to about $250 million a day. Experts say even when airports reopen, security measures are likely to mean it is many months before air travel is back up to speed. Because of that, analysts say the industry very well may exceed the $2 billion loss suffered the year of the Gulf War. Now, we've already seen Midway Airlines, which has been struggling financially, say they have suspended all operations and have laid off 1,700 people immediately. And it is not just U.S. airlines. Asian carriers are seeing their losses mount as more and more flights to the U.S. are canceled. Europe certainly will be affected as well. And it's not just airlines. The entertainment, hotel, and restaurant industries are all considered vulnerable. As we will see, this event will be felt for months to come. Jonathan, back to you.
Maggie, thanks very much. The markets, the air travel system in the United States, and above all, the victims. We want to remind you that for more information on the attacks and the aftermath, please consult our internet site. We have complete information, including the latest reports from the United States and around the world, photo galleries, video and maps, and you'll find it at CNN.com.
The disruption caused by the attacks has affected a number of events. The United Nations has postponed a World Children's Summit in New York City next week. A question mark hangs over the scheduled World Bank-IMF meeting in Washington. And Sweden has canceled a weekend summit of 14 heads of state. Sports have also been affected. Major League Baseball games were canceled Wednesday and will be Thursday as well. While in Europe, UEFA Cup football matches were called off as a sign of respect. Doubts also hang over the Ryder Cup, which is scheduled to get underway in England at the end of the month. Several golfers advocate that the event be postponed. And for the most part, the U.S. government was open for business Wednesday. As Brooks Jackson tells us, for many government agencies, it was hardly business as usual.
The mail was moving on the day after, but more slowly. Planes were still grounded. The Postal Service scrambled to ship more mail by truck and train. It was like that throughout the federal government, which was struggling back to normal after being all but shut down Tuesday by the terrorist attacks.
The prayer will be offered today by our chapel.
The House reconvened a day after the Capitol had been evacuated.
We mourn our dead and reach out with prayer and acts of compassion to all those families splattered with blood.
The Senate reconvened also.
Senate will be in order.
But little business was done. The day was devoted mainly to denouncing terrorism. Several committee hearings were canceled. Outside Washington, the humdrum business of government ground on. Social Security offices were open, mostly, although 43 in and around New York City were closed for the day. Federal storm trackers kept tab on Hurricane Erin in the Atlantic and Tropical Storm Felix, neither a threat to U.S. shores. Agriculture Department officials continue to monitor western wildfires. 2 new fires, 2 old ones contained. A light day. Good thing because 2 teams were sent to deal with the unnatural flames in New York and Washington. In Washington, where federal workers had been sent home the day before, about half showed up for work at the Department of Transportation, a typical agency. Many parents stayed home because schools were still closed. In the midst of all this, the Postal Service announced it would seek a 3-cent increase in the price of a first-class postage stamp. Big news in normal times, which these are not. Brooks Jackson, CNN, Washington.
The International Space Station's 3-man crew caught a frightening view of the destruction. Smoke from the World Trade Center clearly visible from the space station more than 200 miles in orbit. As the station passed over North America, the crew commander used a camcorder to film the aftermath.
We could see New York City and the smoke from the fires. Our prayers and thoughts go out to all the people there, and just wanted the folks in New York to know that their city still looks very beautiful from space. I know it's very difficult for everybody in America right now.
In New York City itself, the damage was, of course, much closer at hand. People are still at work through the night trying to find the people and help them, if they can, affected. We return now to New York City and CNN's Garrick Utley. Garrick?
Jonathan, of course, the work is continuing here, but there's something that we've been hearing in our reports this evening, early morning hours, East Coast time, and in fact we've heard it really since the attacks on Tuesday morning. That is a new sense of fear, of anxiety, of vulnerability about Americans, not just around the Pentagon or here in New York, but indeed across the country. And what does that really lead to? How are Americans going to respond to this? Well, if we look back at the 20th century, not long gone, generations were formed by World War II and World War I before that, by the Korean War, by Vietnam, by the whole atmosphere of the long Cold War and the threat of nuclear annihilation. Well, fortunately, that's gone now. It's now the 21st century, but there's a new kind of enemy. We may not know who or where that enemy is, but it's out there, or maybe it is within. Here's some thoughts about that.
The parallel has been drawn between these sneak attacks in 2001 and the one on Pearl Harbor in 1941, and how both were
a date which will live in infamy.
Except that 60 years ago, President Roosevelt and the nation knew who the enemy was. And since the enemy in Asia and Europe in World War II wasn't hiding, the full weight of American power could be mobilized to achieve victory. Half a century later, the United States could do it again against an enemy who couldn't hide. But now the face of the enemy is invisible, if not as terror and destruction. And we discover the advantage an enemy has who can choose the time, place, and weapons of war. That is what happened in Vietnam, where superior American military strength was inferior to the tactics of a largely invisible enemy and its willingness to take casualties. And the enemy is not always found in war. One of the greatest tests to face Americans was the Great Depression. Americans were fearful about their future in 1933 when Franklin Roosevelt warned that the invisible enemy was within.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed effort to convert retreat into advance.
And advancing is where we are right now in the United States, not just in the rescue efforts or the investigation to find out who was responsible, but also in recognizing that the very fear of terrorism can become the enemy.
And perhaps it's not really that surprising that facing the devil we know is easier, as the old proverb goes, than facing the one we don't know, who today appears to be a terrorist. Jonathan?
Garrick Utley, thanks very much. Relitza?
Commercial air travel has resumed in the United States, but only on a very limited basis. Authorities decided to clear some flights so stranded passengers would be allowed to return home. But Transportation Secretary Norman Mineta says the general ground stop should continue until airports are able to implement new security measures. Officials want to implement a total ban on knives, including plastic ones. Only butter knives will be allowed for in-flight meals. There will be no more curbside check-in or check-ins at sites away from the airport. Only ticketed passengers will be allowed past airport metal detectors. The government wants to set higher standards for airport security personnel and put more federal air marshals on duty at large airports.
Another aspect to all of this, the rescue and assistance effort. Medical officials say massive voluntary donations have provided enough blood for the victims of the attacks, but blood can only be stored for 42 days and more may be needed in 2 to 8 weeks' time. If you're willing to donate blood, please contact the Red Cross, the number 1-800-HELP-NOW.
Images of horror, of devastation, of grief are affecting people around the world.
And for Americans living abroad, it has been especially hard. Jim Bitterman reports.
4,000 miles and an ocean away, worshippers in these distant pews were in no less shock than if they had been looking on from the streets of Lower Manhattan. In this globalized world with its globalized terror, you can be an American in Paris and be just as grief-stricken. Churchmen knew people came to grieve together and used the moment to warn against letting the wrong emotions carry the day.
Yes, we need to go find these people, and we need to deal with them with justice.
not out of mindless vengeance and hatred to repay them, but because we, Americans, we don't live like that.
In the end, it was more than just the shared empathy Americans do. Those whose lives led them to Paris are often exactly the sort of people who know New York, who know Washington, and fear for friends left behind. Expatriated, but still patriots, some of whom believe their homeland has been too disengaged from world affairs.
I really hope that it brings us out of isolation. You cannot make peace worldwide. You cannot have peoples living together if they don't communicate. And the only way to do that is to come out of isolation and work together.
The priest at the Episcopal Cathedral here remembered the words of Douglas MacArthur at the end of World War II. If we will not devise a more equitable system than war, the general said, Armageddon will be at our doors. But the words that echoed longest after the prayer service was over were the ones that came at the very end. Words most in the church had learned from childhood, but in a now and forever less innocent world, words whose meaning will never be quite the same. Jim Bitterman, CNN, Paris.
We leave you this hour with some of the images, the words,
the sadness and grief from people around the world.
I can only say that all those who have lost their lives, and indeed those who are related and have loved ones who have lost their lives, are very much in my thoughts and prayers.
I react to the families hearing the news, how their lives are never going to be the same. And I feel their pain. I saw that building collapse and I broke down in tears. I was just sobbing because this is pain. This is human suffering.
We are here to lay some wreaths, some flowers, and to also show our sympathy in action so that the American people understand that the Palestinians are not their enemy.
On behalf of the citizens of Belfast, I would like to extend our deepest condolences to the people of the United States of America following the terrible atrocity.
My heartfelt sympathy is with the American people subjected to inhuman terrorist attacks which have taken the lives of thousands of innocent human beings and caused unspeakable sorrow in the hearts of all men and women.
I'm Jonathan Mann at the CNN Center in Atlanta.
And I'm Relitza Vasilova. Thank you for joining us.